Standard theory. My name is Damon. In the last video, we talked about the behavioral index and labeled most of the parts. And from here, we're going to start talking about the individual aspects of the behavioral index. We'll get a little more specific. In the previous videos, we talked about the different scales and the thinking types and the communication types. So now we're going to go all the way down to the individual units and define each one of those. And to begin with, we'll do the Z0 scale. And the Z0 scale is this part here in the center, and that's the scale that defines our unit that the rest of the system is based on. And the individual parts of that are called the components of impulse. And the way that we represent those are with a couple of symbols on top of the scale. And there are three of them. And the first one is referred to as impulse, and that's sort of just the kind of open circle. Then the second one is subtraction, which is a line there right in the middle. And then the third one is going to be compression, which is more of a solid kind of circle there. So on the Z0 scale, or the Z0 scale, we have three components, and the first one is going to be impulse. The second one is subtraction. And the third, compression. So these three collectively are going to define one cycle of communication. This is how we think of a complete process of environmental experience, and that's considered to be our most primal type experience. It's just raw information from the environment. And these components explain the process of being exposed to that information, trying to make some meaning out of it, and then storing it somewhere in memory. So each of the components has its own set of associated phenomenon, and we can go through each one of those and sort of explain what happens during the experience of each one of those components. So in the component of impulse, that process is described by putting the attention to the environment. So in general, a person is just going to exist in some kind of environment, and at some point, there is a potential for the information in the environment to exceed what the person is familiar with. It will exceed a specific amount of information, a specific amount of density, but at some point, that information in the environment will call for the attention of that person to go to that information density. And once the attention turns to the environment, the process of impulse is sort of initiated. And that's something that is just basic kind of primal type experience. There's not really anything necessarily special that has to happen, so long as everything's working the way it should. There's not any kind of other problem otherwise with functioning. And that's what you consider the impulse that begins the communication with the environment. And once the attention has moved to the environment, you can move to the next component of impulse. So the second component is referred to as a subtraction. And there are a couple different things that are really important with the subtraction. And one of them is the idea that the information that initiated that impulse is going to exist somewhere in the environment as an observable phenomenon. And the second thing is the information that's in the environment should also be represented within the structures of the brain in a congruent way. There should be a copy of the information in the environment, and there should be some representation of that information within the structures of the brain. So whether it be something that's seen or heard, whether it's from temperature or anything like that, there should be some iteration of that information in the environment, and it should also be within the structure of the brain in some pattern. So during the subtraction, there should be some comparison of information, and that information that's being compared is that representation of the environment. And during subtraction, that information from the environment is compared to anything that may already be stored within the structure of the brain. And it's during that comparison that the brain determines how meaningful that information is. And it's a way to measure how familiar that information in the environment is. And it's also a way to figure out what needs priority. And very loosely, you can relate that to the need for survival and so on. But during that comparison, a couple things can happen. One of them is that the brain is familiar with what that thing is, and there's no need to go any further, and the process kind of just terminates itself. The other thing that can happen is that the brain decides that whatever has happened in the environment does have meaning to it. It's something that is important, and at that stage, that information can be stored within the structure of the brain. And that process of actually storing that information is the third component of impulse, which is compression. And compression takes that pattern that's being compared and it changes it somehow into a low energy format, sort of an energy saving format. And in doing so, the brain gains familiarity with the environment. So that entire process of impulse on the Z0 scale is designed to save energy in recognizing things in the environment. So one way to think about an alternate sort of set of processes is thinking of the amount of information that requires your attention in the environment, and then imagining that every time that information is present, you have to continually apply your attention to that problem. And once that keeps happening, eventually the brain may tire itself out, it may become stressed, and to some extent it requires energy or some other process to allow that attention to be drawn and for the comparison to be made. So the entire process of storing that information prevents the sort of background process of the brain from being forced to experience something that is already kind of present there. So that's sort of maybe an evolutionary kind of way that you could think about that. But the entire purpose of that is to gain information and become familiar with the environment. And that explains the way that the brain compares information and chooses what to store in memory. So one of the primary ideas of standard theory is the idea that this entire process of going from impulse to subtraction to compression equals one cycle of communication. So there are various areas of the index where understanding this unit is very important, and understanding how it changes and why it changes is very important. So one sort of very simple and preliminary thing I'd just like to go ahead and mention are the sort of ratio units that each one of these represents. And it's sort of based on the dynamic that allows sort of the impulse to be sent and the information to be compared, and then the result of that to be stored. And the way that we think of that is by applying a magnitude to each one of those. And it's just a way to think about it. It's not necessarily exactly what that magnitude is, but it does give a fairly intuitive way to think about how much of each thing is happening and the ratios between them and so forth. And the way that standard theory applies magnitude to each one of these is through these units, and impulse is sort of defined as 1/2 of a unit. So the ratio of information that's being sent in impulse is considered to be 1/2. And the amount of impulse, according to standard theory, is going to determine how much information is going to be compared. So the process that sort of initiates that attention is also going to influence how much information is observed in the environment. and that's considered to be a ratio of 3 halves. Or you can think of it as 1.5 units. That's sort of the idea that 1/2 unit of impulse is going to be proportionate to 3 halves units of subtraction. And something that allows you to think about the abnormal side of things are any sort of adulterants, chemicals, medications, so forth, that will change the initial impulse to any ratio besides 1/2. So sometimes you'll get an impulse that is sort of containing more energy than 1/2, or sometimes you'll get an impulse that has less energy than 1/2. And if that's the case, then your subtraction potentially is going to have more information than 3 halves, or also potentially less information than 3 halves. But according to standard theory, if everything is going the exact way it should, if the brain's using all the correct salts and action potentials, and there aren't anything that is getting in the way besides what the brain is designed to do, then the completely normal standard ratio that we can use to think about that process is going to be 1/2 unit of impulse and about 3 halves units of subtraction. So that 1/2 unit is going to encode for exactly 3 halves of information. So that's kind of the proportion from impulse to subtraction. And after that entire comparison and subtraction happens, there should be a way to reverse that impulse. And that's sort of considered the ratio of compression, which is just going to be the opposite of impulse. So we think about that as negative 1/2. And if we add all these together to complete our cycle of communication, then that tells us that this entire thing is going to be 3 halves units of information total. So our sort of definition of our cycle of communication is that one cycle of communication is going to equal about 3 halves units. And it's a little bit difficult to say exactly what the unit is. There are probably different ways to express them, but just to think of them as an interval ratio unit, you can think of them as 3 halves units. And if you just kind of compare the definition of the cycle of communication is the amount of information that's being compared. So we can define a cycle of communication overall to contain about 3 halves units of information. So each cycle of communication can be thought to have that ratio of information. It can be thought to be in some proportion of that dimensionality. And you can think of this 3 halves as whatever you'd like. You can think of it as a square, you can think of it as a dot, whatever you choose to represent it. But the magnitude of that unit is considered to be 3 halves according to standard theory. And it's the same thing as saying, you know, a dozen or half dozen or 20 or whatever. But that's just the way that we define the ratios between these. And for that reason, each cycle of communication is thought of as an interval ratio unit. So one cycle of communication is 3 halves units. If you kept that pattern going, then 2 cycles of communication would be 3 units, and so forth. But you can just think of them as specific units. The ratios and all that stuff aren't exactly important until some other interpretations of the index, but it is important to note, especially thinking about abnormal things, how these are related to one another. So you have some standard amount of impulse that encodes for some standard amount of informational experience and comparison, and then you reverse that impulse in order to store the information in some way. And that essentially describes our individual unit, our individual cycle of communication. The thing that I think is worth mentioning is sort of the entire process of conceptualizing this. And if that's kind of difficult to resonate with, or it's kind of difficult to you know, put yourself through or kind of self-experience that, there's a chance that one of these, as on an individual level, there's a chance that one of these may be happening out of proportion. Maybe there's not enough impulse going on, maybe there's too much impulse, maybe the subtraction is dealing with too much information, or maybe the compression just isn't happening. And those very loosely can be indicative of some kind of imbalance. Maybe there's some kind of medication or adulterant, maybe there's fatigue, or there are all number of things that can influence these. But what we're assuming is that at these ratios, everything is going to continually happen in the most optimal sense. So if for some reason you have some trouble kind of conceptualizing this, or kind of having sort of the self-experiential sort of phenomenon of it, then there's a chance that it's just that something may be at a different ratio or different proportion. And the implications of that are better described in the non-standard behavioral index. There's a good chance that if you get into the non-standard behavioral index, that you see what happens when the issues sort of manifest themselves in the observable characteristics and the other parts of the scale. But that is one thing to keep in mind, is that these very likely may happen at an alternate ratio, and for that reason it may not resonate in terms of resolving itself in order to move to the next thing. And if that is the case, then there's a potential that something on the non-standard behavioral index would describe what you may be going through. This is essentially all that the C0 scale pertains to. It's just the components of impulse, which is impulse, subtraction, and compression, and that's what defines the cycle of communication, and that's sort of what defines our unit. And that unit is what we're going to use to observe behavior. And once we see that a person is able to obtain and store information from their environment, from there we want to see what happens with that information. And standard theory is essentially saying that if we observe people's behavior and what they're doing based on that unit, then we should get some insight into certain patterns that emerge, and we should see something that just explains or points to why people behave in a certain way, or why they communicate in a certain way. But it's all based on observing this particular cycle of obtaining information from the environment and storing it somehow in memory. So to try to transition into the R scale, which is the faculty of intelligence, it is very important to note that any given individual has to go through this process a certain number of times, and you have to go through this successfully, and there are all kinds of other prerequisites, and explaining that entire process will sort of push us into the faculty of intelligence, and from there we can discuss that faculty and also explore each individual characteristic of communication that is organized on the R scale. So now that we've defined our unit of communication, we can start looking into the R scale. And the R scale is a completely different faculty, so it's important to discuss some of the differences between raw environmental experience and the R scale. So everything about standard theory is looking at the most optimal version of things, and it's considering that everything is going the way that it should in terms of what the brain needs to function at the highest level. So with the R scale, and with it being a completely different faculty, there are lots of prerequisites that are sort of required in order to access that faculty. Unfortunately, it's not something that just happens on its own. It is definitely something that requires a little bit of doing to obtain. And all those prerequisites are sort of represented by this sort of slanting line that goes up into the R scale. So this represents all the different things that have to be in place in order for a person to access the faculty of intelligence. And there are several different things that have to happen. And just functionally, people have the potential to experience intelligence, but they may not start at this lowest threshold. And that's related to the idea that there are different thinking types, that there are different communication types, and so on. So starting at the lowest threshold can actually be quite difficult, but if we want to describe everything, we need to start at that lowest threshold. We have to define what that is and so forth. So when it comes to utilizing the faculty of intelligence, some of the prerequisites involve experiencing impulse on the Z0 scale a certain number of times. You have to sort of store a sufficient amount of information, and then from there you have to find yourself in a sort of safe environment, in contrast to being somewhere where you don't feel safe or where survival is a priority. And you also have to have a sufficient amount of energy available for the brain. You have to have a specific balance in terms of your metabolism and diet. And there are other factors like being part of a group, being sort of like a social creature, as it were. And in a more contemporary sense, there are all the social distractions we have, like media and TV and internet, radio, those kinds of things. And those can prevent the sort of lowest threshold of intelligence from being achieved in favor of some sort of larger amount of stimulation, as it would be in a group or with radio and media and things like that. So in order to move from the Z0 scale into the scale of intelligence, you have to address all those different things. You have to be able to ignore other things in your environment. You have to feel safe enough to not worry about survival. You have to separate your own ideas and your own thoughts from other people, and so on. You have to be of a certain level of metabolism and diet and all that. So if all those prerequisites are met, you have the potential to access the scale of intelligence. And the very simple thing that you're doing in intelligence is thinking about all the compressions that we've had. And what you want to do is think about an experience that you've had sometime in the past that's been stored within the structure of the brain. And then you want to think about some other experience that you've had. And what you want to do is reactivate one experience, reactivate another experience, and then you want to make a connection between them. And then making that connection in your own internal environment, sort of applying unique meaning to those internalizations, you gain access to what would be the faculty of intelligence. And the thing that really sets that apart is that it doesn't have anything to do with where you are specifically. It doesn't have to have anything to do with the environment. It's not necessarily based on survival, and it's not necessarily based on relationships and that sort of thing, at least at the lowest threshold. So you have to be able to apply your own meaning to your own individual internal experiences. And just mentioning that can seem very difficult because of all the factors, maybe part of a group, or there may be the need for survival, or the kind of over-connectedness of the world and so on. But this process of combining these internalizations by making meaning between them is the entire hallmark of the R scale. So this is our lowest threshold. This is the simplest kind of basic case scenario. And that defines everything else that happens on the R scale. So to actually utilize the faculty of intelligence, you have to be able to make those connections between those ideas. And it's very difficult to do that from the lowest threshold. But there are other communication types and are other thinking types. So even if you don't necessarily start at this lowest threshold, there is a chance that you may utilize one of the other communication types or one of the other thinking types. And those may resonate with you or describe your situation or be a little more familiar than what's described in the sort of most simple case, lowest threshold explanation. Now that we have the sort of dynamic at the lowest case threshold, it really only makes sense at this point to start defining what happens every time we get this process. And every time you make this new connection between ideas, you can refer to that as a characteristic of communication. So that becomes its own unit. That becomes its sort of cycle of communication for the R scale. So if you think back to the Z0 scale, our cycle of communication here is defined by the components of impulse. And the unit is very similar to the amount of information being compared to the environment. So that unit is defined by the amount of subtraction that's there, and that was 3/2 units that we have here. So if we think we're combining 3/2 and we're combining 3/2, this gives us about a dimensionality of 3, but we can just think of the process of combining these as one unit, and that one unit is referred to as a characteristic of communication, which when compared to our cycle of communication is about double the amount. So we kind of go from 3/2 units or 1.5 units in impulse to about 3 units in intelligence. And every time we do that, we're sort of imagining that we're creating an additional unit of experience. And one thing that is doing is sort of putting stress and strain on the brain. One of the requirements is the additional energy and the sort of level of diet and metabolism to do that. And furthermore, it takes quite a bit to prefer to use this type of faculty rather than just focusing on the environment. So for all those reasons, the dimensionality in the R scale is a little bit bigger. It's about double, and it sort of continues to double from there. And that will describe sort of what we see when we navigate through that. But every time we do that, we think of one characteristic. So once we have this together, we refer to that as a characteristic of communication. And from there, we're going to observe what happens and sort of define what we see at every characteristic of communication. So this would kind of be considered the first characteristic of communication. And that process is going to just continue, and we'll have the second and third characteristics. And what we'll do is just go ahead and define what these are, how they're named, and start getting pretty specific into them. So previously, when the R scale was introduced, we labeled everything, and there were thinking types, then there were communication types, and then there are the individual characteristics. So these three characteristics, the first three characteristics, they're part of horizontal thinking type, and they're part of silent communication. And these are the three individual characteristics that are associated with silent communication. So the order that these go in is going to be silent, which is the communication type, and what we observe based on that unit is going to be something called a silent identity. That's sort of the way that we name the first characteristic. So they're pretty much interchangeable. The first characteristic is going to be the same thing, but the way that standard theory just kind of names that or refers to it is a silent identity. And when we get to the abnormal behavioral index, it's a little bit more intuitive as to why we'll say the first characteristic, and then in standard sense it's silent identity. In a non-standard sense, there's a different term that we can use to sort of differentiate normal from abnormal. But everything that we're talking about at this point is just going to be normal. So the first characteristic, in a normal sense, is referred to the silent identity. And that's just saying that if a person is able to take those ideas, reactivate them, take another idea, reactivate it, and then make a connection between them, the process of making that connection at the lowest threshold is what we call silent identity. So if that process goes to resolution, we can say that a person has displayed the first characteristic of communication, which is silent identity, and that's the standard process. And the entire hallmark of that is being able to make those connections regardless of where you are. It doesn't matter if you change environment, it doesn't matter if you're on the beach, if you're at the casino, if you're at a football game, none of that stuff really makes a difference, because everything that you're dealing with is going to be something that's been internalized. And making your own unique individual meaning of it in a way that allows you to resolve that process is part of silent identity. And once again, there are all kinds of prerequisites to doing that. So by the time you observe somebody displaying that characteristic, you should be able to recognize, you can sort of learn or kind of train yourself to recognize, the associated phenomenon when a person is sort of internalizing their own, you can kind of see the wheels turning in there when they're internalizing their own individual, their own silent identity. There are other terms you can use besides silent. You can also say self-identity or something like that, but standard theory refers to the first characteristic of communication as silent identity. So the thing to recognize with the R scale is that everything that you do is going to require additional energy. It's going to require energy beyond what baseline is, and it's going to require energy beyond survival. You need a certain amount of metabolism, and so on and so forth. And it becomes very apparent when you continually try to create these new ideas. And if you continually try to expend that energy, at some point you realize that you're not able to just do it all the time. It does require some amount of additional consideration. You have to be well rested and all kinds of other stuff. And to consider all that stuff, you kind of run into, or sort of will realize that you're running into a problem. And that problem is that you need additional energy. And the way that we consider that in standard theory is through the second characteristic of communication, and that's referred to as silent interaction. And that's what's considered to be the second characteristic of communication. So in order to actually resolve your silent interaction, the thing you have to do is change your body status. You have to do something that will, in awareness, change your status. So there are a multitude of things that go along with that. The amount of rest that you get is going to be part of your silent interaction. The amount of food that you eat is going to be part of silent interaction. The amount of exercise that you get, your stress level, your muscle function. There are a whole number of things that are going to influence what happens in silent interaction. And just to be kind of very deterministic with it, the thing that you're essentially influencing is your brain chemistry at that point. If you look into neurochemistry and psychiatry and so forth, there are about a dozen or so inhibitory molecules, and the whole purpose of those being there is to prevent the brain from spending too much energy. It's sort of to facilitate survival and so on, and that's something that is its own study and can be sort of, you can look into that and research that if you like. But essentially what we're doing at the point of silent interaction is trying to satisfy those inhibitory processes. And in doing so, what you're trying to do is release all that extra energy and use that extra energy and spend it on trying to solve problems, trying to solve your own internal sort of environment and so on. So using silent interaction is going to be basically the same level of influencing anything about your body status. So eating, sleeping, resting, grooming, finding shelter, finding work, anything that allows you to remove or satisfy the inhibitions in your body is going to be related to silent interaction. And the same way that you have to go through impulse a certain number of times before you can move forward, the same way you have to sort of recognize that through identifying, go through silent identity a certain number of times. After you complete a certain number of silent interactions individually, then from there you start realizing sort of more logical steps to things. And you realize that if you sleep, once you awake and everything went the way it should have, once that cycle resolves itself, you may realize that you may be less tired, you may feel more rested. And after you eat something, you may feel less hungry. Or after you have something to drink, you feel less thirsty. And you sort of start recognizing that if you take the steps to participate in that silent interaction, in that body status change, that there's some kind of outcome to that. And once you start realizing that, you can start aiming at those outcomes rather than just being forced to do whatever your body's telling you to do. And once you get to that point, you deal with the third characteristic of communication, which is referred to as silent orientation. And once you get to silent orientation, you now understand the consequences of things, and for that reason, you can do those things without your body telling you to, without survival telling you to, without just inherent primal need to do that. So some examples of obtaining silent orientation are realizing that maybe you have to be up early in the morning, so you put yourself to bed at a certain time rather than waiting till you're completely exhausted and just drop. Similarly, you may think, oh, well, I'm kind of hungry right now, but I have other things to do, so I'll worry about having lunch or something later on, rather than just feeling hungry and constantly kind of being left to the whim of the environment and being forced to suffer through that primal impulse. So having a sufficient silent orientation is going to allow you to decide what to do about your body rather than just being forced into it. And the more that you learn about which things influence your body, the more you can decide what to do about it. And that decision sort of brings us to an additional definition of what it means to actually attain the silent orientation. So when it comes to the silent orientation, there's a definition that is provided in the book version of standard theory. And the other way to refer to a sufficient amount of silent orientation, a sufficient amount of resolution of that, is the free will junction. So one thing that is sort of a subset or a consequence of silent orientation is the free will junction. And this is one of the few times where people actually have free will. There are all types of philosophies surrounding it, and I won't really get very deep into that right now. But essentially what the free will junction is the ability for a person to decide what they do with their understanding. And if you think about the consequences of all these things, of having your own internalizations, being able to put your body into kind of an optimal state, and then choosing what to do from there, you have the potential to utilize that additional energy to do something. And in general, it's a very simple thing that you can do. And essentially what you find yourself with is some additional energy and some additional resource. And you can choose to direct that one way or the other. And the way that you direct that is organized into two primary parts. And the first one is something that I refer to as an inward orientation. And the second one is an outward orientation. So once you have all this additional energy, once you've gone through all this and you kind of have an understanding of how to get there and so forth, you have the choice at that point as to what to do with that additional energy. And inward orientation means that you are going to take all this extra energy you have and you're going to focus on yourself. You're going to focus back on your silent interaction, and you're going to focus on sort of making meaning of what you've been through and sort of silently identifying meaning in your experiences. And that just means that you're going to go back to focusing on yourself as an individual. You're going to sort of take that energy and work on building your own internalizations. And that's referred to as an inward orientation. So you can direct that energy inward back toward yourself and start using it to do things like grooming, maybe preparing foods, or organizing or cleaning or whatever. You can do things that will allow your silent interaction to be easier to obtain, and that essentially just allows you to focus that energy on yourself. So the other thing that you can focus on is an outward orientation. And in that sense, you have some understanding of what you've been through, as simple as it may be, or as seemingly mundane as it may be. It could be the smallest of things, but you realize that you've completed something of that to that extent. You've created some kind of internalization, and rather than continuing to focus on it, you want to tell somebody else about it. And in that way, you can turn your orientation outward to other people. And that's what allows us to kind of continue on toward the rest of the R scale. And you can kind of think of it as being an introvert or an extrovert and just people having that tendency, but people are capable of both. It really just depends on, the circumstance and so on. But it's not until you really have that additional energy through going through all this stuff to actually choose what you can do. But that's really the extent of what we can choose to do. That's pretty much it. That's the extent of free will, sort of in the whole philosophical kind of argument. That's basically what free will is. That's all we can do, is focus on our own internalizations or try to share those internalizations with other people. So if you choose the inward orientation, you're going to stay in the silent communication type. But if you choose the outward orientation, then you sort of continue to the next communication type. And once we get through silent communication and we continue to the next communication type, we'll deal with something called intimate communication. And both of those are still under the umbrella of horizontal thinking, and that's still part of the R scale. So what we have with these right here is just a definition of this first bar, which is the first, second, and third characteristics. So that's basically what we've defined so far in the behavioral index. We've gone through the components of impulse. We've talked about some of the prerequisites that are required to get into the scale of intelligence, which is this sort of sloping line. And then we've covered the first three characteristics of communication. So when you notice that somebody is making their own internalization without respect to relationships, without respect to the environment and so forth, then you can sort of say that they've achieved the first characteristic of communication, which is silent identity. When you see that they're doing things to change their body status, they're eating, they're sleeping, they're grooming, and so on, they're participating in something called silent interaction. So silent identity and then silent interaction. And then finally, once they realize what they can do with that stuff, and once they start choosing to deal with themselves even after they've already done all that, or if otherwise they start choosing to communicate with people, then you can say that they've achieved the third characteristic, which is silent orientation. So those are the sort of hallmarks of silent identity, and these are much, much more basic than symptoms necessarily. It doesn't rely on language. It doesn't rely on pretty much anything other than recognizing this complete baseline status before any of the other kinds of things. But what we'll do next is just continue on through the index, and we'll start defining intimate communication. Now that we've defined silent communication, we're going to continue on and define intimate communication. So silent communication is all about the individual to the individual and no one else. It's the self with the self and nothing else. It's all about internalizing things, and it's all about dealing with body status, and it's all about understanding the consequence of those different actions. And one thing you can do is maintain an inward orientation where you continue working on those internalizations, or you can maintain an outward orientation, which is where you start communicating your internal experiences to another person. And that process of choosing to communicate with another person is a thing that initiates and sort of separates intimate communication from the silent communication type. So the first sort of step into intimate communication is referred to as intimate interaction. And the term intimate means one individual with exactly one other individual. In the non-standard sense, people will try to share this information with a group of people, or they'll be part of a group, a family unit, or a group of friends. But the type of information is meant to be communicated to exactly one other individual at a time. So that's sort of some of the reasons that the entire process of experiencing intimate communication may be difficult, or may break down at some point, or has some kind of roadblock to it. So the first thing that you have to be able to obtain is a sufficient amount of silent communication. And then from there, you sort of have a platform to get other people to recognize that you want to communicate with them. And everything about this is one-on-one. So not only do you have to be able, as an individual, to be able to do that, the person who you're communicating with must also obtain that fourth characteristic, which is intimate interaction. So both parties kind of need to be on the same wavelength. Each individual needs to be kind of on the same page with one another, and they have to be able to maintain this level of activation in the brain in a stepwise kind of way. So that entire process of obtaining that and realizing that you're ready to turn all the energy to another individual is the sort of hallmark of intimate interaction. That's sort of the phenomenon that describes that. So the thing that makes intimate communication a little bit difficult is the dynamic that happens once you have that platform to work from. And that dynamic happens between the fifth and sixth characteristics. And those two characteristics are essentially the information. They kind of represent the information that's going to be exchanged between the two individuals. And those two characteristics are intimate identity and intimate orientation. And it's kind of difficult to describe one without the other, because they really depend on one another, and they really sort of work in tandem in order to facilitate the dynamic of communicating those experiences with one another. And there are a few other things to mention about it. There is some neurochemistry involved. I don't really want to get really deep into that right now, just for the sake of defining everything. But in the fifth characteristic, you sort of consider meaning in terms of what you've been through. You sort of consider the result of experiencing certain things, certain types of communication. And an intimate orientation is where you consider everything. So it's kind of difficult to really explain one dynamic without the other. But once you push the amount of activation and the amount of combinations of information all the way to intimate orientation, you end up at what you consider an overload event. And that's sort of the neurochemistry sort of stepping in to facilitate that. But essentially, what standard theory is saying is that at the sixth characteristic of communication, you're ending up with sort of an overload, kind of a sort of maxing out your circuits. And that's what leads to the release of different neurotransmitters, and it depends on the situation and so on. And it can also be a lack of release of neurotransmitters, but there's some kind of maximum activity that we see in intimate orientation. Once you go through that experience of that maximum activity, you have to figure out what happened. You know, it's kind of beyond what the brain is normally able to process, and you have to determine one way or the other how you feel about that thing. You have to give either a positive sort of a report on what happened, or you have to give a negative report on what happened. And those two kind of work together to create the intimate identity. So the orientation is literally the kind of maximum limit, and then the intimate identity is how you interpret that sort of experience. And that's sort of the dynamic that happens between people. And what's supposed to happen in the best case scenario is that one person will experience their sort of overload event, their intimate orientation, and they tell somebody what happened. And the other person will listen to that, and they'll try to interpret it, and hopefully they will use that information to experience a new overload event. And then the initial person will realize that, and they'll try to explain what happened, and then they will try to obtain their own overload event. But that dynamic happens in between people. It's one individual with exactly one other individual, and that's how one-on-one communication is meant to be facilitated according to standard theory. So it's very dynamic. It deals with all kinds of things, neurochemistry, neurotransmitters, and it requires all this other stuff to have happened. You have to have had sufficient amount of environmental experience. You have to have been able to internalize it and obtain all the extra energy, and then you have to choose to talk to somebody, and then finally you get to the point where you're sharing information and you're making all these new interpretations of that information, and it becomes very exhausting very quickly. It's very taxing. It requires a lot of energy. It requires a lot of steps, and for that reason, it's very limited. And even so, experiencing this dynamic is the entire purpose of communication, behavior, all this stuff. The entire goal of achieving sort of the maximum, the sort of maximum fulfillment of your individual experience is getting through this dynamic. And that maximum fulfillment is what's defined as the intimate orientation. And then your interpretation of that is your intimate identity. And there are a couple things that I want to sort of parallel to this. And that's the idea that even though that sounds great and it sounds fun and it sounds like something that everyone should be able to experience, unfortunately, you can also go through things that are maybe not so fun. So one way to think about this is through the neurotransmitters. So let's say that you get to the intimate orientation and there's a release of neurotransmitter. And we'll indicate that by putting this sort of dot on top, the circle on top here. That potentially will lead to what you consider a positive identity. And that's sort of the dot on top kind of thing. We'll have the plus mark with the line underneath. But there's also the potential that you get to this kind of overload phase, and for whatever reason there is no release of neurotransmitter, and the thing kind of stalls out, and it's different than sort of the maximum achievement. Then you can think of that with the sort of plus mark underneath the bar. And what you can think of this, the way you can think of this if you want to really be deterministic with it, you can think of this as sort of a positive orientation where there is a release of neurotransmitter and everything kind of cycles the way it should. And then you can also think of a negative orientation, which is where there is no release of neurotransmitter, and so for some reason that process stalls out, or it's not novel, or it's not new, and that can have an effect. So you can relate this positive neurotransmitter to a positive identity, meaning that whenever you report on what happened during that overload event, you say, yeah, it was enjoyable, it was great, I got the whole rush of telling somebody about my day and so forth. But even if that happens, it could also lead to a negative sort of thing. Maybe you didn't want to tell somebody that, or maybe it was kind of embarrassing to say that that was something that was close to you or special to you. So similarly with a negative orientation, you can be glad, you can be very happy that you didn't tell your secret. You can be very glad that the person that you were talking to didn't recognize what it was that you were experiencing and so forth. And similarly, You can think of that as a bad thing. You can think of it, I think I did it backwards, but anyway, the point is that whether you have a positive or negative orientation can influence whether you have a positive or negative identity associated with it. So if there is a release of neurotransmitter, you sort of determine whether that was positive or negative based on your own experience and the circumstances and everything like that. And if there was not a release of neurotransmitter, you still have to determine whether that was positive or negative. And for those reasons, it's, in my opinion at least, it's more important to interpret your experience rather than saying, yes, I actually did it, or no, I didn't do it. It's more important to say what that meant to you during that time and under those circumstances and stuff. So I didn't do a very good job with representing them with those there, but that's kind of the point, is that sometimes there's going to be a positive orientation and it's going to lead to either positive or negative identity. Sometimes there's going to be a negative orientation and it'll lead to either positive or negative identity. But that's sort of the dynamic that happens between intimate identity and intimate orientation. And the sort of resolution of that is the intimate identity. You have to sort of determine what the meaning of all that stuff was. And if we have the chance to get a little bit deeper into here, there are a couple other things to consider. But the most important thing right now is the idea that that process is limited. It doesn't just happen all the time. There are only a certain number of times that you can go through that before the cycle just breaks down. And normally it'll be some environmental thing. You'll run out of things to say, you'll get tired, because all this stuff requires all that energy and all those steps to get to it. And eventually you kind of have to, calm back down and pull all that stuff down. But when you don't do that, you end up with the abnormal side of things. You continually try to, force that process to happen, and that leads into the abnormal side of things. So the normal thing to do is to move away from that dynamic. That's after that dynamic stops, the normal thing to do is move away from it. And you're essentially going to keep moving away until you kind of get back on the same page with the other person, or it could be to the point where you have to go rest, or you have to have something to eat or drink or what have you. But that's one of the biggest problems with experiencing the entire process of constructive intimacy, is that it is temporary. It's very difficult to maintain for any amount of time, and even if you do, normally something else is going to interrupt it. But being able to experience it in a way that it resolves is the optimal kind of thing. And then in addition to that, being able to step away from it and going back to doing whatever you were before is sort of the other aspect. So those are kind of the reasons that it's so difficult to deal with.